The individual recognized in history as Fidel Castro first entered the world on August 13, 1926, in Biran, situated in Oriente, the easternmost province on the Cuban island. His father was Ángel María Bautista Castro y Argiz, born in 1875 in the Galicia region of northern Spain. Ángel was drafted into the Spanish military during the early 1890s and subsequently dispatched to Cuba, at that time still among Spain's few remaining American colonies. His mission was to participate in suppressing a second war of independence that had ignited in 1895. Unlike earlier Cuban independence movements, this one proved successful, largely due to the intervention of the United States. Consequently, Cuba severed its ties with Spain in 1898. The character of this independence struggle meant that Cuba subsequently fell under the geopolitical influence of the U.S., a dynamic that would significantly shape the nation's history throughout the 20th century. Ángel Castro briefly went back to Spain but then emigrated to Cuba, entering through Havana's port in 1905. Across a range of occupations in the 1900s and 1910s, he was employed as a laborer by the American United Fruit Company. By the 1920s, he had established his own agricultural enterprise, hiring workers for the sugar plantations. At one point, his workforce surpassed 300 individuals, and he fostered strong business relationships with American firms in Cuba. Thus, Fidel's origins were within a relatively prosperous family. In 1911, Ángel Castro married María Argoda Reyes, and the couple produced 5 offspring. Following the dissolution of this marriage, Ángel proceeded to have 7 additional children with Lina Ruz Gonzalez, a farm servant who became his mistress and subsequently his second wife. These children included Fidel and his younger brother Raúl, who would become his most steadfast political confidant throughout his life. Fidel's early life was peculiar, being born outside of marriage during a period when illegitimacy still carried considerable social disapproval. Ángel Castro arranged for Fidel to be raised using his mother's family name and amongst the children of sugar plantation laborers. Many of these individuals were Haitian and other Caribbean workers who endured challenging, impoverished existences. Fidel's later perspectives on the influence of American businesses on the island's economy and its workers may have been significantly influenced by his experiences living alongside his father's employees during his formative years. When only 6 years old, Fidel and his older siblings, Ramon and Angela, were sent to Santiago de Cuba to commence their education. There they resided in meager conditions with a tutor who struggled to provide basic necessities. Intriguingly, for an island where Roman Catholicism was dominant, Castro was not baptized until the age of 8 in 1934. This action appears to have been undertaken to ensure his admission to the La Salle boarding school. He was then enrolled in the privately funded, Jesuit-administered Dolores School in Santiago and subsequently El Colegio de Belén in Havana. Despite showing interest in history and geography, Fidel never excelled academically, although he was a capable athlete. In 1943 and 1944, he was recognized as Havana's most exceptional sportsman for his age group, demonstrating skill in baseball, basketball, high jump, and middle distance running. Castro's formative years coincided with a period of social upheaval in Cuba. In the decades following the nation's 1898 War for Independence, the island underwent significant political instability and limited economic progress. The country's political framework was deeply corrupt, with politicians at all levels engaged in widespread bribery and unethical conduct. Much of this was driven by American commercial interests that controlled substantial portions of the Cuban economy. Furthermore, the island had become a sanctuary for the Italian mafia and other American criminal organizations to operate from. Simultaneously, the nation's economy remained underdeveloped, relying on the resource extraction of commodities like bananas, coffee, and primarily sugar. After this period, he relocated to Florida in the United States, but he would later re-enter Cuban politics with profound repercussions. In 1945, Fidel Castro commenced his law studies at the University of Havana. It was here that his political inclinations started to become apparent as he became involved in several student protest movements against the pervasive corruption in Cuban politics and the ruling elites. This was a highly volatile period on the campuses of the island nation's universities, where armed gangs were commonplace and participated in widespread criminal activities, reflecting the broader breakdown of law and order throughout Cuban society. During this time, Castro's anti-American stance initially emerged when he joined the Committee for the Independence of Puerto Rico, an organization established to advocate for the neighboring Caribbean islands' independence from the United States. Puerto Rico had effectively become an American colony after the Spanish-American War of 1898, yet it was never granted statehood status, a condition that persists to this day. Castro and his fellow student activists in Havana opposed this ongoing situation and viewed it as indicative of America's continued strategy to dominate the Americas and oppress the nations of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. It was also during these years in Havana that Castro initially gained a reputation within wider Cuban society for his dissenting actions. In the winter of 1946, he was featured in several newspapers following his critiques of the government and its corruption and violence. He subsequently cultivated extensive connections with numerous left-leaning political factions within the country, most notably the Union Insurrectional Revolucionaria, or Insurrectional Revolutionary Union. At the time, law enforcement suspected him in the murder of a rival student leader, although no charges were ever substantiated. While he developed a reputation for compelling public speaking, he never became a leading student figure himself, and on multiple occasions, he was unsuccessful in campus elections. In the summer of 1947, Castro briefly left university to participate in a campaign to overthrow the right-wing government of Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Trujillo, similar to Batista in Cuba, was a military ruler supported by the United States. In late July of that year, Castro was among the leaders of a group of approximately 1,200 rebels who departed from Cuba for the Dominican Republic with the objective of ousting Trujillo. However, this endeavor was quickly suppressed by a joint effort of U.S., Cuban, and Dominican forces. Many were apprehended, although Fidel reportedly escaped by jumping overboard from his ship into shark-infested waters while holding a gun above his head. This event is significant as the first instance where the future Cuban leader engaged in direct armed rebellion in the Caribbean. Following the unsuccessful expedition to the Dominican Republic, Castro entered a phase where his revolutionary activities escalated. He became increasingly prominent within student protest circles against the Havana government. Throughout 1948, he undertook several journeys to Panama, Venezuela, and Colombia to engage with left-wing revolutionary groups there. Particularly in Bogotá, Colombia's capital, in the late spring of 1948, he played a central role in efforts to establish a Pan-American Students' Conference, intended to oppose right-wing governments across Latin America. Meanwhile, back in Cuba, later that year, he married Mirta Díaz-Balart, a philosophy student. This was considered an unlikely pairing as Balart originated from a prominent Cuban family with extensive connections to the country's political elites, the very individuals and groups that Castro was increasingly opposing outright. The couple even received lavish gifts on their wedding day from certain individuals against whom Castro had protested, and they spent their honeymoon in the United States. Despite these peculiar contradictions, the marriage lasted for 7 years, and Fidel and Mirta had a son named Fidelito before their divorce in 1955. In the early 1950s, Castro founded a law practice with 2 associates, Jorge Azpiazu and Rafael Resenda. However, these were fellow leftists, and the firm primarily engaged in pro bono work, defending workers who had been mistreated or unfairly dismissed from their jobs. Furthermore, Castro deepened his understanding of leftist ideology during these years, extensively reading the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the foundational figures of communism, as well as more contemporary political thinkers like Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. At this stage, Castro was inclined towards transforming Cuba through peaceful means, and in 1952 he ran for election to the Cuban Congress in the national elections as a candidate for the Partido del Pueblo Cubano, Ortodoxos Party. Castro now embarked on a path to overthrow the Batista regime through violent revolution. Within weeks of Batista's return to power in Cuba, Castro began developing a new revolutionary project, which he and his followers, including his younger brother Raul Castro, called the Movement. Their initial action occurred within months and became a pivotal event in the Cuban Revolution. On July 26, 1953, Castro and approximately 100 others launched an attack on a Cuban army barracks at Moncado in Santiago de Cuba. The assault was a complete failure. Nearly half of the militants were killed by the 400-strong garrison, and most of the survivors were captured, with only a few managing to escape entirely. Fidel was among those captured and subsequently sentenced to 15 years in prison for leading an insurrection against the state. During his trial, he delivered an extensive defense in what would become his most celebrated speech. La historia me absolverá, history will absolve me, in which he condemned Batista's regime and articulated his own political and economic visions. Castro served his sentence on the Isla de Pinos, the second largest island in the Cuban archipelago. While imprisoned, he rebranded the movement as the 26th of July movement, commemorating the date of the Moncado Barracks attack. Despite this continued defiant behavior, Batista made the decision to release Castro from prison in the summer of 1955, after he had served less than 2 years of his sentence. It was a decision that the dictator would soon regret. Following his release in 1955, Castro went into exile in Mexico City, where he and his brother Raul began organizing action against Batista. Here they encountered a fellow Latin American revolutionary, an Argentinian medical doctor named Ernesto Guevara, more widely known by his nickname, Che Guevara. Guevara had traveled throughout South America in his youth and had become radicalized by the extreme poverty he had witnessed. Poverty he attributed to American neo-imperialism. In the ensuing months, the Castros, Guevara, and their followers trained and planned in Mexico for their return to Cuba. Meanwhile, the Batista regime back in Cuba was becoming increasingly repressive. Thus, in the summer of 1956, Castro and slightly over 80 followers departed Mexico aboard a large yacht named the Grandma, reportedly named after a previous owner's grandmother. After a series of mishaps, they ran aground at Playa Las Coloradas, near Los Cayuelos in Cuba, and were attacked by Batista's forces, who forced them into hiding in the Sierra Maestra mountains. Only 19 of the original group survived at this point. It was an unpromising start to their armed rebellion, but one that would yield surprising results in the months and years to come. From their relatively secure position within the Sierra Maestra mountains, Fidel and his followers initiated a guerrilla war against Batista's regime, orchestrating bombing campaigns against government forces. Their numbers soon grew as more and more individuals joined the insurgents in the mountains. Attacks were launched against government barracks to acquire additional weapons and explosives, and by 1957, Castro was leading a small army in the rural areas of Cuba. Soon, additional militant groups emerged, also desiring to overthrow Batista's regime. As a result of these circumstances, by 1958, Batista's forces were experiencing mounting strain from the revolutionaries. As summer approached, the balance of the conflict began to lean towards Castro and the 26th of July movement, as numerous soldiers within Batista's ranks started to abandon their positions, horrified by the atrocities against civilians they were being ordered to perpetrate to suppress the revolutionaries. Ultimately, on December 31, 1958, Batista relinquished his position and fled the nation for the Dominican Republic, taking with him $300 million in illicit funds. On January 2, 1959, Castro's forces seized Moncado Barracks in a symbolic gesture, and 6 days subsequently, on January 8th, they marched into Havana. The Cuban Revolution, despite its unpromising beginnings just over 2 years prior, had achieved victory. Castro did not immediately assume power personally. Instead, the moderate lawyer Manuel Urrutia Leo was announced as the country's president within a provisional government. However, Castro and his adherents dominated the cabinet of this new interim administration. Fidel's military authority was formally recognized through his appointment as representative of the rebel armed forces of the presidency. Fidel then assumed office as his successor in mid-February 1959. This was a role he would maintain until 1976, when a new constitution was enacted, after which he became the president of the Council of Ministers of Cuba. Castro would eventually continue in this capacity until 2008, ensuring he held high office in Cuba for 49 years following his initial appointment as prime minister in 1959. It had always been anticipated that Castro would be the most influential figure within the new regime upon its ascent to power. A significantly more contentious issue was the nation's future relationship with its neighbor and Batista's previous backer, the United States. Castro was an avowed leftist, but for a period, figures like Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate for U.S. president in 1960, believed Castro could be persuaded to align with American interests. This perspective was misguided. Castro rather quickly steered his country towards an alliance with the Soviet Union and similarly inclined left-leaning regimes across Latin America. Furthermore, his elevation of radical leftists such as Guevara, to senior government positions, clearly indicated the regime's desired direction for the country. Relations with the U.S. were further strained in the initial year or so of the new regime's existence when Castro mandated the nationalization of American commercial interests situated in Cuba. Tensions further increased when Castro attended a United Nations General Assembly in New York City in September 1960, where he openly associated himself with regimes opposed to the U.S. The escalating hostility soon resulted in an attempt by the United States government to intervene militarily in Cuba. Even prior, under the administration of Dwight Eisenhower, substantial funding had been allocated to initiatives aimed at destabilizing Castro's regime. By the time President John F. Kennedy was elected as president in late 1960, the U.S. government was already actively collaborating with Cuban exiles who had departed their homeland and settled in Florida and other regions of America since 1959. Many of these Cuban exiles had organized themselves into a counter-revolutionary unit termed Brigade 2506 and its political wing named the Democratic Revolutionary Front. These entities were cooperating with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency by early 1961. However, to mitigate suspicion domestically and to allow the Kennedy administration to distance itself from the group, they were undergoing training in Central America, specifically in Guatemala. By the spring of 1961, a plan had been formulated for approximately 2,400 of these Cuban paramilitaries to initiate a naval invasion of Cuba, supported by advanced U.S. military equipment, including B-26 bomber planes and M41 tanks. But despite all their planning and support from the U.S. government, the operation would culminate in complete failure and would irreparably damage U.S.-Cuban relations for the duration of Castro's life. The invasion force set sail from Nicaragua and Guatemala by boat on April 16, 1961. The preceding day, the U.S. had bombed several locations in Cuba. Then on the morning of April 17th, the 1,400 Cuban paramilitaries began landing along the coastline within an inlet of the Gulf of Cazones, or Bay of Pigs, on Cuba's southern shore. Within hours, Brigade 2506 was engaged in a firefight with a local militia. This provided sufficient delay for Castro and his government in Havana to react to the landing. Fidel then instructed Captain José Ramón Fernández to launch a counterattack. In the hours that ensued, bombings commenced to destroy the invaders' fleet. With this accomplished and Brigade 2506's escape route obstructed, Castro's forces advanced, with Fidel assuming personal command of the operation at this stage. The original strategies for the invasion had incorporated substantial air support from the U.S., but this was rescinded by Kennedy's administration. Lacking this, and with their escape route blocked, the invasion force was doomed to fail. On April 20th, just over 3 days after their initial landing, Brigade 2506 surrendered, having already lost 118 men and with hundreds more sustaining injuries. Consequently, over 1,200 Cuban paramilitaries were captured by the Castro regime. The response to the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion was varied. For Castro, he could now assert a significant triumph over the American imperialists, whom his regime denounced as oppressing and seeking to control Latin America. Conversely, the failed invasion of the country was a foreign policy setback for Kennedy's administration. Not only was it revealed to have plotted to overthrow a foreign government, but the poorly executed nature of the invasion appeared weak from a military standpoint, although Kennedy's government did manage to negotiate the release of over 1,000 of the Cuban paramilitaries in 1962 in exchange for over $50 million worth of food and medicine for Cuba. Apart from this, the most notable result of the attempted Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was that it propelled the country further towards the Soviet Union within the Cold War divide. Within weeks, more intensive negotiations were underway between Moscow and Havana as Castro sought greater trade and military connections with the Soviet Union and the nations within its communist bloc. Then in December 1961, Castro publicly declared that he was a communist, effectively aligning his country with the Soviet camp. In response, the Kennedy administration promoted the idea that the Organization of American States should expel Cuba. A confrontation appeared imminent. Consequently, in the months following the Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro had negotiated an agreement with the Russian premier, Nikita Khrushchev, whereby the Soviet Union would deploy its advanced ballistic missiles at locations in Cuba. This would guarantee that the country would be protected against a potential invasion by the United States or American-backed counter-revolutionaries. It was a momentous decision, one that would precipitate one of the foremost political crises in modern history. On October 14, 1962, Major Richard Heiser, the pilot of a U.S. U-2 spy plane, was conducting a reconnaissance mission over Cuba when he detected and photographed a site on the island where Russian SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles were being assembled. 2 days later, the American president, John F. Kennedy, was informed about the Russian missile sites being established in Cuba. This marked the start of the so-called 13 days of what has become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy immediately convened a meeting of the National Security Council and several other key advisors. It was determined that these sites were, or would soon be, capable of launching Russian nuclear missiles, and that these missiles would be capable of reaching every major American city on the East Coast in minutes or hours. During this initial meeting, Kennedy was advised by several individuals to promptly move to directly bomb the missile sites in Cuba, and perhaps then initiate a direct invasion of the island to overthrow Castro's regime and ensure that no further threats of this nature could be directed against America. However, Kennedy opted for a less aggressive action, but one that nonetheless ushered in a period of intense political crisis in the days that followed. The crisis that now emerged primarily unfolded between Washington and Moscow, notwithstanding the fact that the nuclear warheads precipitating the crisis were situated on Cuban soil and explicitly involved Castro's regime. Nevertheless, the political gamble that was in play here was that Russia would furnish Cuba with substantial financial and military aid in return for Castro's regime, permitting the Soviets to position their missiles on Cuban territory. It should be emphasized that the Soviets deemed this a strategically acceptable course of action. By 1962, the United States had possessed its own ballistic weapons and then nuclear weapons stationed for many years in regions that were equally geographically proximate to Russia as Cuba was to the United States, notably Turkey on the Soviet Union's southern border. Khrushchev and the principal members of the Soviet government in Moscow believed that they could install nuclear weapons in Cuba in a manner analogous to how the U.S. had previously stationed them in Turkey. After all, if the United States had their warheads aimed at Moscow and other Soviet cities from nearby locations, then why should Russia not reciprocate? But if this was their reasoning, they were soon to be proven wrong, albeit in a way that would serve Russian interests in the long term. The crisis intensified in the days subsequent to the initial meeting on October 16th. On October 22nd, after initial diplomatic exchanges failed, Kennedy's government ordered what was described as a quarantine of any shipping entering or leaving Cuba. The word blockade was avoided as, under certain legal definitions, this would have constituted a declaration of war with Castro's Cuba. American planes and ships were rapidly deployed to the Western Caribbean to monitor all ships attempting to enter Cuba and to assess whether their contents included war material. That evening, Kennedy delivered a live televised address to the nation in which he affirmed that any attack initiated against any country in the Western Hemisphere from Cuba would be considered an attack on the United States by the Soviet Union. He then explained that the purpose of the quarantine that had just been introduced was to ensure that no further Russian military hardware arrived in Cuba. However, Kennedy maintained that the aim of the quarantine was not to block off all goods entering the country in the same vein as the Russians had severed all supplies by land into West Berlin during the Berlin blockade of 1948. The next move now rested with the wider international community and Khrushchev's government in Russia. In the days that followed, the crisis deepened as America's allies and those of the Soviet Union escalated their rhetoric and resolved to come to their respective allies' aid if the crisis evolved into an outright war. On October 24th, Pope John XXIII issued a plea for both sides to consider the implications of their actions. This effectively signaled a further escalation in the crisis. Thus, on October 24th and during the hours that followed, the world stood perhaps as close to the outbreak of a nuclear war as it ever has, all precipitated by the installation of the nuclear ballistic missiles in Castro's Cuba. In the hours that followed, the U.S. requested a meeting of the United Nations Security Council, while also dispatching hundreds of bomber planes, including nearly 24 B-52 bombers carrying nuclear warheads, which were deployed into the air around Cuba and also near Soviet airspace. The world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. The 25th, 26th, and 27th of October marked the most critical phase of the Cuban Missile Crisis. As diplomatic negotiations continued between Russia and the United States, ships en route to Cuba remained subject to checks for nuclear warheads by the American quarantine. Negotiations did commence between Moscow and Washington on the 26th, but these were nearly jeopardized by the downing of an American plane by a surface-to-air missile launched from Cuba. Khrushchev later stated that this attack had been ordered by Fidel's brother Raul rather than being a directive of the Soviet Union. In Washington, a decision was now made to invade Cuba if another plane was shot down, but more cautious judgment prevailed. By the close of October 27th, negotiations were advanced for the Russians to withdraw their missiles and halt the development of launch sites in Cuba in exchange for Kennedy's government removing its own nuclear warheads from Turkey. Additionally, Kennedy wrote to Khrushchev stating that the U.S. government would respect the sovereignty of Cuba henceforth and not attempt another intervention such as had been undertaken with the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. This agreement was sufficient for both the U.S. and the Soviet Union to save face, and Cuba's independence would subsequently be preserved. Thus, the Cuban Missile Crisis concluded after 13 days on October 29, 1962. In the wake of the crisis, a pact was established to enhance communications between the U.S. government and the Soviet regime in Moscow. The Cold War also progressively entered a period of de-escalation, one that witnessed tensions gradually diminish throughout the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, prior to a renewed upswing in the 1980s. For Fidel's Cuba, the outcome of all this was that the island nation would not be subject to direct intervention by the United States thereafter. Castro persisted in steering the country further into Russia's area of influence within the Cold War during the early 1960s, journeying to Moscow and several other Soviet cities in 1963. As a result of this state visit, he initiated a series of reforms of Cuban society and its economy and politics in the ensuing years that mirrored those prevalent throughout the Soviet Union. Thus, Cuba would remain to function as an antagonistic country in opposition to the United States on its very doorstep. Meanwhile, America, for its part, while abstaining from direct interference in Cuban affairs subsequently, continued to impose wide-ranging economic, diplomatic, and trade sanctions against Castro's regime in Cuba, measures that would have considerable repercussions for the country's economy in the years and decades ahead. The subsequent era of Cuba's progress under Fidel's rule yielded mixed and uncertain results. Due to a combination of elements, some linked to the American economic sanctions applied to the island, and some that were the consequence of ineffective economic planning by Castro's government itself, the country descended into a major economic decline in the 1960s. Much of the country's economy remained dependent on the sugar industry, much like that of the wider Caribbean had been since the 17th century, but other developing industries such as the casino and tourist sector, which had been expanding in the pre-revolution period, now declined sharply. As a result, the country was increasingly reliant on financial aid from the Soviet Union throughout the 1960s, which at one stage totaled nearly 40% of Cuba's GDP. However, subsequently, conditions improved. While the state was the principal actor, the Cuban economy nevertheless enhanced considerably in the 1970s and the 1980s, even during periods of general international economic sluggishness. But as we will see, the decline of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and the ultimate end of the Cold War ushered in a new period of economic hardship for the Cuban economy in the late 20th century. One of the most significant accomplishments of the Castro regime must certainly be the healthcare system that was developed in the decades under Fidel's rule. Cuba's healthcare system was already among the most successful in Latin America prior to the Cuban Revolution, but these achievements were extended from the 1960s onwards. Universal healthcare became free and equally available to all Cuban people under the Castro regime. The country was also highly effective in the 1990s and 2000s in eliminating and reducing the spread of HIV, and has developed numerous groundbreaking medical interventions in recent decades ahead of the more advanced Western world, most notably a pioneering lung cancer vaccine. The country's education system similarly prospered during Fidel Castro's time as ruler of the country. All educational institutions were placed under state ownership and administration following the revolution. The education system, along with the healthcare system, was prioritized by the administration and was heavily invested in. In recent decades, the Castro regime allocated as much as 10% of the country's gross national product to the education system, roughly twice the amount spent by comparable developed nations on average. Immediately after the revolution, a campaign was initiated to eradicate illiteracy in the country. By 2000, over 97% of Cubans in their young adult years were literate, Moreover, a study in 1998 by UNESCO determined that Cuban students had a markedly higher level of education than their counterparts in much of the developed world. This extended to third-level institutions such as the University of Havana, which were also nationalized in 1961. Furthermore, the country was notably progressive in how it has facilitated equal access for women to higher education, as well as men. Perhaps the most prominent indication of the success of both this education system and the Castro regime's healthcare policy is that institutions such as the University of Havana have become appealing options for international students. Despite the circumstances in which Cuba had become the central stage of the Cold War in the years immediately following the Cuban Revolution, in the 1970s, Castro shifted the country to a more neutral position in the global conflict between the United States and its allies in NATO and the Soviet Union. This centered on the non-aligned movement, a form or unofficial union of developing nation-states that had arisen in the 1950s as an alternative to aligning with either of the two major power blocs in the Cold War. The driving force behind the non-aligned movement had initially been India under its Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Communist Yugoslavia under Joseph Tito. At first, Castro's appearance at the fourth summit of the non-aligned movement in Algeria in 1973 had provoked criticism from nation-states that believed Cuba was too closely linked with Moscow. However, in the years that followed, Castro managed to distance Cuba away from Russia politically, and in the late 1970s, he served as president of the non-aligned movement. Economic realities and the ongoing sanctions imposed on the country by the United States ensured that the Soviet Union remained Cuba's primary trading partner. But under Castro in the 1970s, the country dramatically withdrew from the front lines of the Cold War. Castro's decision to lessen its biased ties with the Soviet Union was not based on a general reluctance to engage in foreign wars. Indeed, the 1970s saw Cuba become a significant participant in numerous international conflicts in Latin America and Africa, especially the latter. Castro had always been influenced by Che Guevara in his belief that Cuba was just one participant in a broader endeavor of international revolution. Thus, from its earliest days, the Cuban government under Castro had offered assistance to numerous left-wing and revolutionary movements throughout the Southern Hemisphere. Additionally, in the 1960s, Guevara, with Castro's approval, had established a guerrilla movement known as the Andean Project, with the intention of inciting left-wing revolutions in Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina. This specific scheme was abandoned when Guevara was captured and killed by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency in Bolivia in October 1967. Despite this setback, which came as a significant blow to Fidel on both a political and a personal level, Castro continued to operate as a proponent of revolutionary movements in the years that followed throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. In the 1970s, it was Africa where Castro became most active on the world stage and in his support for other revolutions. In the mid-1960s, he and Guevara had supported rebels in the Congo against an American-backed regime. This strategy was expanded in the 1970s, with Castro referring to Africa at the time as the weakest link in the imperialist chain. Consequently, in 1975, hundreds of military advisors were sent to Angola in Southwest Africa, where a civil war had just erupted following the country's independence from Portugal. Castro's advisors were sent to aid the Communist People's Movement for the liberation of Angola against the Western-backed National Union for the total independence of Angola. It was the beginning of an enormous role that Cuba played in a bloody Angolan civil war, which would persist in one form or another for 27 years. By 1991, over 370,000 Cuban military troops and a further 50,000 Cuban civilians had served in Angola as doctors, nurses, and in other capacities. This implies that nearly 5% of the Cuban population served in Angola in some role during the first 15 years of the civil war there. Castro consented to release numerous political prisoners and implement measures that would permit Cubans who had fled to the United States following the revolution 20 years prior to temporarily visit family back in Cuba, albeit under strict conditions. For his part, Castro hoped that the United States would end its economic embargo on the country. While this did not transpire, the more punitive measures were eased, providing some financial relief. Despite certain successes at home within Cuba in developing the country's education and healthcare system, the country was marred throughout Fidel's extended tenure as head of state by an oppressive authoritarian government. As elsewhere, globally, the communist regime did not tolerate challenges to its authority. and there was limited opportunity for political dissent. Press censorship and efforts to eliminate bourgeois or counter-revolutionary elements within Cuban society were widespread throughout the period of the Cold War, though particularly so during the so-called gray years, a period of nearly a decade during the 1970s when Castro's regime was especially repressive. During this period, there was extensive cultural censorship of poets and artists and harassment of intellectuals and academics. The homosexual community particularly suffered during these years. The overall result of all of this was a growing surge of individuals attempting to illegally leave from Cuba to head to the United States, the state of Florida being just a small boat ride away from the country. The gray years began to wane following the establishment of a new constitution in 1976 and a loosening of some state control over the arts, but political dissent remained abhorrent to Castro's regime for years to come. The persecution of individuals within Cuba for opposing Fidel's authoritarian rule led to a major development in 1980 that has shaped much of the Cuban community in the United States. After years of oppression and attempts by tens of thousands of individuals to leave Cuba, Castro's regime decided to temporarily open a port in order to permit individuals to leave the country. This was the port of Mariel and its harbor, situated some 40 kilometers to the west of Havana. For over 6 months between April 15, 1980, and the end of the following October, the port was open for anyone who desired to leave Cuba for the United States. In total, before it was closed again just over 6 months later, approximately 120,000 Cubans left for the U.S. What has become known as the Mariel boat lift became a political issue in America, where the administration of President Jimmy Carter was unsure what to do with the arrivals if they continued to come to the U.S. in such numbers. By the time that Mariel Harbor was closed again, the massive influx of Cubans into Florida and the city of Miami in particular had altered the demographics of the Sunshine State in ways that have had repercussions down to the present day, especially as the Cuban-American vote constitutes a large group with their own political lobby in a state that is consistently a swing state in American presidential elections. The 1980s brought significant change to Cuba under Fidel's rule. The country's economy once more declined owing to a global fall in the price of sugar, the country's principal export commodity. Unemployment increased sharply. As a consequence, Cuba, which had successfully distanced itself from Soviet influence to some extent in the 1970s, found itself drifting back towards a reliance on Russian financial support and the Russian export market again. Yet this was a short-term strategy. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev had succeeded as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. A reformer, he began to initiate a sequence of new policies that aimed to modernize the Soviet Union and bring to an end the Cold War, which had entered a more intense period again since Ronald Reagan had assumed office as U.S. President in 1981. However, Gorbachev's reforms yielded unforeseen consequences, and by the late 1980s, the Eastern Bloc of communist countries stretching from East Germany to the borders of Russia were agitating for wide-ranging political reforms. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed, reunifying the city, the division of which had become a symbol of the Cold War nearly half a century prior. And 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved, bringing to a close the conflict between capitalist America and communist Russia. There was a distinct possibility that the same would transpire in Cuba, but Fidel acted swiftly to guarantee a continuation of his rule. He fortified his control over the Cuban military to prevent any revolt from within the armed forces and temporarily aligned the country with other regimes across Latin America that were fellow antagonists of the United States. Through such strategies, Castro was able to secure a survival of the communist regime in Cuba beyond the end of the Cold War, though the United States signaled its intent to continue to exert pressure on Castro's government by obtaining a vote at the United Nations Human Rights Commission, accusing his regime of extensive human rights abuses. The endurance of Castro's regime beyond the end of the Cold War marked the beginning of an era that Fidel termed a special period in time of peace. But despite Castro's declaration of this being a special time, the stark reality of the 1990s for most Cubans was one of growing destitution. The country was now continuing to endure economic sanctions from the United States and was severed from the funding and support that it had long received from Moscow. Gorbachev's successor, as head of the new Russian state, Boris Yeltsin, harbored a deep dislike for Fidel, and the country offered virtually no support to its former ally. Thus, despite some minor efforts to enhance relations with some Western powers, Cuba's economy collapsed in the early 1990s. By 1992, economic activity had decreased by nearly 40% compared to the level it had been in 1990. Electricity shortages were prevalent across the island nation. Petrol to run cars and for other applications was in short supply, while imports of essential goods such as Russian-manufactured cars completely ceased. Over time, there was a domino effect as increasing shortages of raw materials led to Cuban factories being shut down, further driving unemployment and economic decline. Thus, the special period was actually one of economic freefall in Cuba. The economic crisis of the early 1990s did elicit a response. Within broader Cuban society, there was a clear undercurrent of unrest regarding the difficulties ordinary people were experiencing. In response, the regime sought to alleviate the economic situation before it resulted in efforts to overthrow the government, as had occurred across Eastern Europe. Accordingly, from late 1991 onward, gradual plans were being initiated to allow private industries to operate in Cuba and to permit the use of American dollars as an alternative currency. In addition, some political reforms were initiated that aimed to make the country's government more representative of the people and to bring in younger political leaders to replace many of the senior figures who, like Castro, had risen on the strength of their involvement in the revolution back in the 1950s. Inward and outward travel were also eased, and this significantly contributed to the rejuvenation of the country's economy as tourism, with most visitors arriving from Spain and Latin America, quickly supplanted sugar production as the most vital sector of the Cuban economy. As a result, by 1996, the country's budget deficit had been nearly eliminated and foreign investment was increasing, though with criticisms abounding that the socialist ideals of the revolution were being betrayed. Despite this deregulation of portions of the Cuban economy, Fidel himself continued to portray himself on the world stage as the inveterate opponent of capitalism and sided with many regimes around the world that were antagonistic towards the United States and the Western capitalist powers in general. Some of this was, in retrospect, statesmanlike. For instance, Castro had long been a staunch opponent of the policy of apartheid practiced by the South African government, and indeed, Cuba's prolonged involvement in the Angolan Civil War had partially been to provide aid to South African dissidents. As a long-standing friend of the leading anti-apartheid campaigner, Nelson Mandela, Castro was invited to attend Mandela's inauguration as the first black president of South Africa in 1994. Perhaps more debatable was Castro's leadership of a new alliance of Latin American states that espoused an anti-American stance and favored socialism. In this, Fidel was most closely aligned with Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, with Castro providing healthcare expertise from Cuba in return for Venezuelan oil. Other countries, such as Bolivia, would associate themselves with the Pink Tide, as this movement became known. But the subsequent collapse of Venezuela politically and economically has considerably tarnished the reputation of this initiative. It was also in the post-Cold War period that Castro's personal life became a subject of some attention. This followed from the defection of his daughter to the United States in 1993 when she sought asylum there, after which she widely criticized her father's regime. Castro's broader private life was a closely guarded thing, and also considerably unconventional. He married at least twice, but also had several long-term affairs. His marriage to his second wife, Dalia Soto del Valle, resulted in 5 sons, but he also had numerous other children from his other relationships. His closest relationship, though, was with his younger brother, Raul, his associate in power since the late 1950s. Generally, though, Castro was known to be reserved and private, and despite being the head of the communist regime, Fidel did not forego having more material wealth than the average Cuban, and in addition to a large estate called Punto Chero in Havana, he had several other large residences and often traveled by limousine. Despite this, the public image of the man who was referred to as the comandante, or the commander throughout his long reign, was carefully constructed and controlled, and Castro rarely appeared in public wearing anything other than a green military uniform. In 2003, the Cuban National Assembly granted Castro a further 5-year term as president of the country. However, just 3 years later, in July 2006, Fidel transferred power on a provisional basis to his long-standing ally and brother, Raul Castro. Initially, this break was intended to allow Fidel sufficient time to recover from surgery that he had undergone for a serious intestinal problem that had led to internal bleeding. It was the first time since the Cuban Revolution's success and the victorious entry into Havana in 1959 that Fidel was not effectively at the head of the state. This retirement was made permanent a year and a half later. By February 2008, the Comandante had not been seen in public for over 19 months. And when the National Assembly met to determine who would serve as president for the next 5 years, it was perhaps unsurprising for Cuba and the wider international community to learn that Fidel, who was 81 years of age at the time, would not stand for another term. Instead, power would pass to his brother Raul, who was elected as president of the National Assembly on February 24, 2008, bringing to an end his brother's 49 years as head of the communist regime in Cuba. Castro's retirement was spent largely out of the public eye as his health deteriorated. He continued to publish articles in Granma, the official newspaper of the Cuban Communist Party, and occasionally gave public lectures. He composed his memoirs, the first volume of which appeared as The Strategic Victory and provided an account of the war against Batista's regime in the 1950s. In 2011, he relinquished his last major position in politics when he stepped down as Secretary General of the Communist Party of Cuba in favor of his brother Raul. Yet he continued to play something of a role on the international stage in his final years, becoming an advocate of nuclear non-proliferation and warning of the risks of a war between the United States and a nuclear power such as North Korea. However, he did not meet with U.S. President Barack Obama when, in March 2016, he became the first American head of state to visit the country since the revolution. Just over half a year later, Fidel died on November 25, 2016, of an undisclosed illness. A funeral procession was undertaken along the route through which the revolutionaries had traveled across Cuba in 1958 and early 1959 before his ashes were interred in Santa Ifigenia Cemetery in Santiago de Cuba. The Cuba that Fidel left behind after his nearly half a century as its dictatorial ruler is one of mixed legacies. Today, the country continues to be ruled by the Communist Party of Cuba as a one-party authoritarian state in much the same way as other communist regimes such as China survived the end of the Cold War. However, like China, the country has been compelled to move away from a strict adherence to socialist ideas since 1991, though Cuba has remained a strong advocate of left-wing Latin American socialism. As such, there is still a planned or controlled economy there, one, though, that does allow limited private enterprise and that has become increasingly reliant on tourism. The growth of the latter sector has opened up Cuba to the outside world in the last 20 years in ways that were unthinkable for most of Castro's tenure as head of the regime. However, there are many things that continue to mar the lives of Cubans. The country has a poor human rights record and one of the worst records in terms of freedom of the press. Meanwhile, the economy remains markedly underdeveloped and continues to have some economic sanctions imposed on it by other countries. And yet, a series of political and economic reforms in recent years offer the prospect of a more open society and economy developing in the near to medium future. Fidel Castro was an individual with a lengthy political career that it is difficult to assess. He began as a Latin American revolutionary, one who wished to remove American influence from Cuba and reform the country's politics. There is no questioning that when he led the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s, the island was plagued by appalling corruption and misconduct in government, epitomized by Fulgencio Batista. Thus, there was considerable legitimacy to anyone reacting against the government in Cuba at this time. But whatever the circumstances of the Cuban Revolution and the island's role in the Cold War in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there were several decades thereafter, during which Castro's reign over Cuba can be evaluated. Based on these years, it must be viewed as a fairly mixed legacy. Some reforms and innovations that were introduced into Cuban society were very positive. And the country enjoys an education and healthcare system that is accessible to all, and that would be the envy of the average American, who has to pay high fees to access the best universities or shop around for jobs that offer private health insurance. As a result, Cuba has been able to make remarkable medical breakthroughs for a country of its small size and is a net contributor to global medical aid efforts. But contrasted with this is the fact that Castro's Cuba was a highly oppressive authoritarian regime that persecuted much of its population over the last half-century in order to maintain Castro and his followers in a position of unchallenged power in Havana. Castro may be regarded as a man who oversaw a regime that demonstrated how communism could benefit many of its citizens in the realms of education and healthcare, but whose rule was ultimately tarnished by his repressive actions and authoritarianism. What do you think of Fidel Castro? Was he a nationalist patriot who liberated the Cuban people from an oppressive dictatorial regime? Or was he simply another dictator himself who in turn oppressed the Cuban people? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.